is this overarching concept that you really have to understand. It's a fundamental concept. It's so fundamental that it's one of the few things they really want to make sure that the students leave the course understanding. So we're going to focus on that. The lectures won't be as long as last week, and we'll sort of see where we can get with them. So federalism. So the fundamental question coming out of the Revolutionary War was, we were 13 sovereign states, sovereign countries. But that system that we had under the Articles of Confederation, that wasn't working very well. And so we needed to figure out something, a stronger central government. But the states didn't really want to give up that sovereignty. They didn't want to give up the power. So we had to answer this question of, what powers do the states have? What powers does the federal government have? Who gets to be the boss? And that was the fundamental question. So we call that being the boss in the terms of the state. Being the boss is called being a sovereign. Sovereignty is the supreme and final governing authority. The person who's sovereign is in charge. So we would refer to kings as sovereign, right? And so the United States is sovereign. The state of Texas is sovereign. We'll talk about why in a little while. And so when we talk about a sovereign state, we talk about something with that final governing authority. So to understand this, we have to kind of go back and think a little bit about the structure of our government, and we have to start with this fundamental concept, something we've already talked about this semester. The question of, where does all governing power come from? Now, you'll remember in the classical system, in the divine right of kings type system, power came from God and was given directly to the king, right? And so in that system, if we said, who is sovereign? Well, the king is sovereign because God made him sovereign. We have a slightly different view in the United States. We believe that all power to govern comes from the people. It is the people who have sovereignty in the United States. The government is created by the consent of the people. And it's our elected representatives who exercise that consent on our behalf, that sovereignty on our behalf. So Benjamin Franklin, in free governments, the rulers are the servants and the people, their superiors and sovereigns. So we, the people in the United States, are sovereign. That's wonderful. That's great, you say. But what does that actually mean? It's a great slogan. It fits on a nice postcard. It makes people feel good. But how does that actually work? We don't have a direct democracy. We don't have everybody in the country voting on all the rules. We don't have that kind of system. So who actually exercises that authority on our behalf? Is it the central federal government? Is it the various state governments? Is it something else? How do we make it work? So to understand this, and this is a chart, it's from your book, and it's a really good chart because it shows there's sort of three different ways of thinking about government. We'll return to this chart in a minute. I normally write this up on the board, but obviously I can't because we're in the digital age now. But think about this chart. We'll come back to it at the end and go over it again. But you can see in the chart you have three different things. You have people represented by the little people symbols. You have states represented by pictures of various states. And then you have the central federal government represented by the Capitol building. So there are three different ways we can kind of divide up power, three different ways we can decide on how power is shared. But it's important to remember that in this model, power always originally comes from the people. So the people are the well that all sovereignty comes from. And then that sovereignty can be given to a central government or given to state governments. So here we go. The first way, and the most popular way that governments are defined, is in a unitary system of government. So what is a unitary system? In a unitary system, there is a strong central national government. And all local and regional governments get their authority from the strong national government. This is about 80% of all governments around the world. You spin them out, stick your finger down, you're probably going to hit on a unitary system of government. Not 100% true because a lot of the federalist systems of government are actually larger, but for our purposes, we're just going to say it is. So it's the most common form of government. So basically, only in a unitary system, only the central government is sovereign. All of the subunits are dependent upon the unitary system. So what does that mean? Well, that means that in a unitary system, there might be something called a state underneath the unitary system. But the powers that state has are completely dependent on what the central government says the state can do. The state has no power independent of that. It cannot in any way go against the national government. And there are, as I said, lots of examples of a unitary system of government. Another way governments can be formed is through a confederate system. In a confederate system, the states are sovereign and the national government is subservient to the states. Another way of looking at this is it's basically a league of independent states. It's a number of states get together and say, okay, well, we're going to kind of write a document and share some powers so that we can all be managed a little bit better. But we are ultimately going to retain our sovereignty. We're going to be separate countries, separate states with our own power. We're not going to give everything up to this national government. So we see things like states having the right to veto central governments. Now, we've seen this theoretically twice in the U.S. The first and most obvious was what we already talked about under the Articles of Confederation. Before we had our Constitution, we saw this confederate system of government. And in this confederate system of government, we saw that the states had too much power, the central government had too little power, and basically the central government couldn't do anything. And that's really the problem with most confederate systems, is there's such a loose confederation that it's hard to really get anything done on the larger national sense. The other time that you're probably thinking of that we've seen this is the Confederate States during the Civil War. Though honestly, that wasn't really much of a confederate system. The central government maintained a lot of power. So I wouldn't necessarily say the Confederate States were a confederate system, but that's another example that we can pull to. So we have these two examples, right? We had federalism. That's what everybody else in the world did. That's what the king did. That's what the states didn't want. Then we had a confederate system. That's what we tried. And that didn't work for us because there wasn't enough to bring these different 13 independent countries together. So what can we do? Because up until this time in history, these were, up until the founding of the United States, these were the only two options. Sovereignty, this right to rule, was considered a single thing. One person had it, everyone else didn't. And you couldn't just divide it up all willy-nilly. So that was sort of the end of it. You had to pick one or the other. But the Founding Fathers very cleverly said, why? Why can't we divide it up? And they created a new system of government called federalism. In federalism, what they do is they take some powers and give those to the central federal government, as we call it, and other powers and give those to the state governments. So all the power still comes from the people, but some of it goes to the central government, and some of it goes to the state government. So basically, we divided the powers of the people, the sovereign powers. We cut them into different portions, and we gave different portions, some to our central government, some to our state governments. And so this is federalism. This is this fundamental idea. Back to the chart, you can see at the top, we have federal system. We have the people in the middle, and they gave some of their power up to the states, some of their power down to the central government. By contrast, in a unitary system, power still starts with the people, but all of that power goes down to the central government, and then the central government decides what power goes out from there. By contrast, we have the confederate system. All of the power with the people, then some of that power goes down to the states, and then the states decide what powers they want to give to the national government. So that's the overview. Okay, so we're done, right? I mean, we just understood what federalism is. Great, we can all go home, turn off the video. Wait, no, don't leave! Ah! Because we're not actually done yet. Now, this would be a lot easier. If I was in a unitary system, or even a confederate system, this would be a lot easier. I could more or less be done now. But now, since we're in this federal system, we have to deal with another question. We know that the powers are divided. But how? How does it actually work? How do we divide up these powers meaningfully between two separate sovereigns? Who gets what? So we divide them up in the Constitution. So the Constitution tells us what happens. The big picture overview is that the central government gets issues related to international relations, so making treaties with other countries, declaring war, controlling international trade, interstate relations, relations between two or more states, so trade between the states, agreements between the states. In theory, the states maintain control of intrastate matters, so matters wholly within their state. So Texas is in charge of Texas, but the federal government is in charge of relationships between Texas and Oklahoma and relationships between the United States and the rest of the world. But of course, again, this is a college-level government class, so it gets a bit more complicated than that. So we're going to talk about the powers that the U.S. government has. We're going to talk about express, implied, inherent powers. We're going to talk about what powers the state government has. We're going to look briefly at the 10th Amendment. We're going to talk about powers they share and powers no one gets. So here we go. So this is pretty simple. So we have national powers. These are called enumerated powers. These are powers that are given in the U.S. Constitution to the central government. So how do we know the central government has these powers? Well, because it says so in the Constitution. It says they have the duty to declare war. So how do we know that the central government has the power to declare war? Well, the Constitution that the states signed off on says they have it. We also have concurrent powers. These are powers that are shared by the federal government and the state governments. They can both have these things at the same time. And then there are reserved powers. These are powers that the Constitution says the federal government, you don't have these. Or more accurately, it says the federal government, the central government, you only have these powers. And anything that you're not given is reserved for the states and the people. Okay, so let's go through what these powers are, starting with the express powers. Like I said, these are found in the Constitution. Specifically, Article 1, Section 8 is where we find most of these. And so the Article 1, the first article of the Constitution, it sets up the legislative branch, and it also lists out a whole lot of the powers. And it goes on for quite a while. It's a very long section spelling out the powers that Congress has. Now remember, and we'll talk about this more later, Congress is the first branch. They make the laws. So how do we know what powers the central government has? Well, it's when the Constitution says the Congress has the power to do this thing. Because the Congress is sort of the acting force in the Constitution as originally written. The executive branch, the presidency, and the courts are really somewhat reactive. The president has the power to enforce the laws that the legislature passes. The courts have the power to interpret and apply the laws that the legislature passes. But it all starts with the legislature. Article 1, Section 8 spells these out, and it goes on for a while. There's a couple of specific ones. I mean, you can see down at the bottom, there's a list of a few of them. Central government can coin money. They conduct foreign relations. They provide for an army and navy. They declare war, etc., etc. They establish courts, and so on. Now, there's a couple we need to specifically look at because they are so important in regulating the government. So, for example, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. The Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. So, what does that mean? Well, commerce, trade, right? Things that affect money. The U.S. Constitution says that the central government, not the states, but the central government is allowed to regulate commerce, trade, with foreign nations, between two or more states, and with the Indian tribes, which is important, but not so important for our subject. So basically, if you are making trade outside of your state, then federal laws apply. So the reason this is so important is because on the surface, it seems pretty simple, pretty straightforward. But the way it's been interpreted is very broad. Because what the courts have said is that basically anything that affects interstate commerce, they can regulate. So there's an example. During the Civil Rights era, during the 1960s, there was a case. There was a small barbecue place. Middle of nowhere. They were able to show that no one had ever been there for more than 20 minutes away. No one had ever been there across state lines. Very small place, middle of nowhere. But the federal government had passed a new law that said that anyone engaged in interstate commerce, or all of these restaurants, they could no longer segregate their facilities. They had to serve African Americans. They had to serve black people, right? So they passed this law. So this small barbecue place brought a case saying this new law was unconstitutional. Why? Well, because the Constitution didn't give the federal government a basis to regulate them. Because, see, the only basis the federal government had to regulate them was the Commerce Clause. And they said, well, we're not engaged in interstate commerce. We're just this small little barbecue joint in the middle of nowhere. Nobody's ever been here from out of state. This is not commerce among the several states. This is commerce wholly within a single state. You can't regulate it. Commerce Clause doesn't apply. The Supreme Court looked at it and they said, well, maybe, but if you look on your table, you have ketchup. And that ketchup came from outside of the state. And we're going to say that's enough. We're going to say just the fact that you have that ketchup, that means that you are engaged in interstate commerce and the federal government can regulate you. That's pretty big. There's another example. During the Bush presidency, California legalized marijuana for medicinal purposes. There was a grandma who had a farm. She had glaucoma. She grew some marijuana for her own personal use. One day, federal agents kick down the door, arrest her, and she gets taken to jail for growing and distributing marijuana. Now, under California law, what she was doing was legal. However, under federal law, what she was doing was illegal, because there is also a federal law that says you can't grow and use marijuana. So, what happened? Well, in court they challenged it. In court they said, well, this is not, there's nothing you can do to regulate it. This is, we're not even selling this. This isn't even commerce. How would you regulate something completely within a state? We're not bringing this across state lines. And the federal government said, well, the Commerce Clause lets us do this. And she said, how is this commerce? I'm not even selling it. And even if I did, it would never go across state lines. And the federal government said, well, yeah, maybe, but you have a nephew, and he's a little bit questionable. And what if he stole some of your marijuana, and he took it across state lines? Then it would be interstate commerce. And the courts agreed, and they said, yes, the federal government can continue to regulate this under the Commerce Clause because there is a danger that it will impact interstate commerce. And so, what does this mean in practice? Well, in practice, as applied by the legislature today, and as accepted by the courts, the Commerce Clause basically allows the federal government to regulate pretty much anything, because they will stretch that idea of commerce, of what commerce is, to incredibly broad lengths in order to cover anything. So, Commerce Clause is very important because it really flies in the face of what we're learning about, which is federalism, this division of power between the states and federal government, because it ultimately works as sort of this super clause that says anything we want to, we can regulate as long as we can make an argument. Now, there is one case where they said, and this is in the entire history of weird stuff the legislature has tried to do, there's one case where they said, the court said, no, legislature, that is too wide. And that was the Lopez decision. That dealt with guns in a school zone. There's a federal law that said you can't carry guns in a school zone. Mr. Lopez was arrested with a gun in a school zone. He was charged by a federal crime, and his attorney said, well, this law is unconstitutional. There's no basis for the federal government to pass it. And the federal government said, well, it affects commerce. And Mr. Lopez's attorney looked at him and said, excuse me? How does a gun in a school zone affect commerce? And the federal government argued that it affects commerce because if you bring guns to school zones, then there's going to be violence in school zones. If there's violence in school zones, kids won't feel safe. If they don't feel safe, they won't go to school. If they don't go to school, they won't graduate. If they don't graduate, they won't get good jobs. If they don't get good jobs, they won't make much money. If they don't make much money, then it will hurt interstate commerce because they can't buy stuff. The courts looked at that and said, no, that's too much of a stretch. They said, that one's a bit ridiculous. We're not going to say this massive spread of power makes sense. So there was one case where they said the Commerce Clause went too far, and I will tell you, people in the federal legislature still are upset about that case. They still say it was courts overreaching. Basically, they should be able to do whatever they want to without interference, is the theory of many people in the legislature. So, there you go, Commerce Clause. Okay, next we're going to talk about the implied powers are necessary and proper clause, also called the elastic clause. It has a lot of names. So Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 says that Congress has the power to make all laws which shall be necessary for carrying out other laws. So basically, if the Constitution says you can do one thing, and in order to do that thing, you have to also be able to do something else, you can do that other thing too. So basically, it's called the elastic clause because it lets you reach in to the express powers in the Constitution and stretch them to cover other things that maybe weren't actually part of those express powers. That's why it's called the elastic clause. So you get to take the powers you have, and if there's something arguably that should be covered as well, well, you can cover that as well. Okay, what about inherent powers? Inherent powers are powers that come with an office or position. So frequently this deals with the president. It's you have this power because you are the president. For example, executive orders. These get a lot of attention. So what are executive orders? Well, the president is the head of the executive branch, right? So every person in the executive branch works for him. So it makes a whole lot of sense that the president would be able to tell them how to do their job. So basically the president gets to say, hey, Department of Justice, you work for me, so here's how I think you should do it. Or hey, postal employees, you work for me, so here's how I think you should do your jobs. That's his job as president. Now, nowhere in the Constitution does it actually say that the president has the power to issue executive orders. But everyone agrees the president has the power to issue executive orders. He has the power to tell people, this is how you should do your job, because it makes a whole lot of sense that the president has that power. It wouldn't really make sense otherwise. Now, where it gets to be a problem is when we start to stretch the definition of executive order. When the president, so in theory, executive orders are the Congress passed a law, and in order to carry it out, I'm going to tell the people who work for me, the president, how they need to do it. But in practice, what often happens is the presidents will issue executive orders to sort of change policy or create new laws that the legislature hasn't created yet. And this is when it starts to become a problem. We say that the president starts ruling by fiat, by sort of executive command. And this has become more and more popular. We saw a lot of it under George W. Bush, and President Obama campaigned mainly on getting rid of executive orders. Then President Obama got into power, realized Congress is completely dysfunctional, so he ruled by executive order as well. Trump won in no small part by campaigning against the sort of executive order idea that the president's in charge, and of course Trump is himself ruling through executive order. And so these executive orders sort of have become a major hot-button issue. They're frequently used not to express how to do your job with accordance with the law, but just what the president thinks should happen regardless of the law. Okay, so those are the powers of the federal government. Now, what about concurrent powers? Concurrent powers are powers that are shared by the federal, which we're using the term federal for central government because that's how it's normally referred to in this class. In fact, the name of this course is frequently federal government. So we're talking about the central government and the state governments, and they both have these powers. For example, the power to tax. Now, the central government can tax you, primarily your income tax, right? But the state government taxes you as well. In Texas, we don't have income tax, but you have property tax, you have sales tax, you have excise taxes, you have a number of other taxes that they can do. Now, all of this is okay because they don't interfere with each other. Everybody can tax us, and it doesn't stop the other guy from taxing us. They can both borrow money. They can both establish courts. Now, this is very important. We'll talk about it when we get to the judiciary. But both parts of government have the power to establish courts. So we have in the U.S. two separate court systems. If you violate a federal law, you go into a federal court most of the time. If you violate a state law, you go into the state court system most of the time. Now, if you've ever been downtown in any major city, Fort Worth or Dallas, you'll see a lot of court buildings. So, for example, if you go downtown in Fort Worth, you'll see the county courts. The big old building has the county courts. Then you'll see the district courts. You'll see family courts across the street. You'll see civil courts to the east. You'll see to the west. You'll see the jail. Behind it, you'll see some more county courts. You'll see the other courts there. You'll see 4 or 5 or 6 state court buildings. There's also a federal court building. It's one building, fewer judges, all of that. And that really gives you a picture of sort of how the division of power works when it comes to courts. Most laws are state laws. Most interactions between the government and the people are state interactions. And so there's a whole lot of state court judges, very few federal court judges. Both the state and federal government have the power to charter banks. Now, this is interesting. I like this one. So you'll sometimes see First State Bank of Texas, and then you'll see First National Bank of Texas right next to each other. And you're like, what's the difference? Well, the difference is which governing authority, the federal government or the state government, did they apply to create their bank? And this can have surprisingly interesting effects. For example, under state law in Texas, in general, if you loan someone money, you can only charge 12% interest. Has anyone here ever seen a credit card? I'm sure you have. Now, those credit cards are issued by banks, and they frequently charge a default interest rate of very close to 30%. 30 is bigger than 12. So, how can you charge an amount in Texas that is twice the amount, more than twice the amount of the legal highest rate in Texas? Well, those banks are chartered under federal law. And so what happens is, under federal law, they say you can charge the interest anywhere in the country that is the same, that is allowed by the state you're chartered in. And some states, like Delaware, say you can charge whatever interest rate you want. So that's why all the banks are from Delaware, North Dakota, or one of these other states that have no limit on it. They charter their bank there in that state that says you can charge whatever interest rate you want. And then, nationwide, they can come into places like Texas with tighter rules on how you can charge interest and do whatever they want anyway. Now, both have the money, have the ability to spend money for general welfare. They can spend money. It's important to note that the federal government doesn't have the power to regulate for general welfare generally, and we'll talk about that more later. But they both have money, the power to spend money more or less however they want to. Okay, what about reserve power? So we talked about the powers the federal government has. How do you know the federal government has the power? It says so in the Constitution. We talked about the powers that are shared between the states and federal government. How do you know those exist? Well, I mean, they just do. They're shared. But what about, there are some powers that only the states have. In fact, most powers are held by the states. When you think about the Constitution, you have to understand that the Constitution is a limited grant of authority to a central federal government. So it doesn't say, hey, federal government, you can do anything. It says, hey, federal government, you can do these things. And then anything that they don't have, anything they're not given, is reserved for the states and the people. Now, it doesn't expressly say this in the body of the Constitution, original Constitution. It basically says legislature has these powers, and implicitly, that means they can't do anything they don't have. However, the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, so the last amendment of the original Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments to the Constitution, it expressly states that. It says, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. In other words, If the Constitution didn't give it to the U.S. government, then the states and the people keep it. So, there's basically the Supreme Court looks at it this way: is it's just a truism. So the 10th Amendment doesn't really have any power. It's just stating something that's obviously true. If you have 3 apples and you give 1 apple to your brother, you still have 2 apples. Those 2 apples didn't disappear. The states and the people had all the sovereignty. They gave up some of their sovereignty to the central government. Where is the rest of the sovereignty? Well, of course, it stays with the people, right? They didn't give it away, so they get to keep it. That's all the 10th Amendment says. Now, they call this reserve powers, and you'll see people frequently cite to the 10th Amendment, especially conservatives will cite to the 10th Amendment, and they'll say, the 10th Amendment says that, the federal government can't do this. Well, no, the 10th Amendment doesn't say the federal government can't do it. The 10th Amendment just says the obvious, that the federal government wasn't given the power to do this. Therefore, it can't. So remember, Constitution, limited granted authority, but for our tests, for our quizzes, for all that, we'll fall in line with everyone else, and the 10th Amendment is the source of reserve powers, is what your book, I think, says, and so I wouldn't be surprised if you see that on a quiz. Technically, not 100% true. The source of reserve powers is simple logic, the fact that the powers weren't given up, but this works as well. So 10th Amendment, reserve powers. Okay, Article 4, Section 5 has the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause says that the Constitution of the United States and the laws that are made under it are supreme. So what does this mean? It means that if there's a conflict between the federal government and the state government, who wins? Well, the answer is the federal government. So if the federal government has something that they're allowed to do under the Constitution, then when they do that, they win. They can override the states. In fact, in some cases, there's something called the Dormant Commerce Clause. You do not need to know about this, but it comes up in some cases where literally they say this power belongs to the federal government. The federal government has decided not to use that power, but that also keeps the state governments from using it, because this power was given to the federal government and does not belong to the states. So we can actually say in some cases the federal government not acting preempts the states from acting. So the Supremacy Clause, the federal government wins when they can act, they beat states. Okay, so we talked about this a little bit earlier, interstate relations. How do we deal with relations between 2 or more states? If Texas gets into a fight with Oklahoma over water, and we are always in a fight with Oklahoma over water, when Texas gets into a fight with Oklahoma over water, who wins? How does that work? Well, if there's a dispute, it goes to the... Let's see, do I go over all this stuff? Okay. If there's a dispute, it goes to the Supreme Court. Ultimately, will handle disputes. There's something called the Full Faith and Credit Clause. The Full Faith and Credit Clause says that... really should have had these in here. Let's see. Full Faith and Credit Clause says that the acts of one state have to be given full faith and credit in another state. So basically, if I get a divorce in Texas, I'm divorced in Oklahoma as well. Privileges and Immunities Clause says that you have to treat the citizens of one state like you treat another state. Extradition Clause, if I murder someone in Texas and run off to Oklahoma, Oklahoma has to send me back. There's something called interstate compacts. These are basically agreements between the states. If Texas wants to enter into an agreement with Oklahoma for how to share water, they can do so. Those are called interstate compacts. They actually have to be signed off on by the federal government in order to be effective. That's part of what the Constitution says, because the Constitution regulates interstate relations. What about local governments? Do local governments have sovereignty? This is actually a very interesting question. It comes up every so often. We've seen this recently with marijuana legislation. Some more progressive cities in Texas have said they're not going to enforce marijuana rules. And the state government of Texas is more conservative, doesn't like that. And so questions that come up is, can the state basically force cities to enforce these laws? Or are the cities sovereign? The legal answer is cities are not sovereign. Cities do not have any power. Cities are completely dependent upon the states. In essence, each state is a unitary government with regard to everything within its own state. This is called Dillon's Rule. It's the rule in Dillon's case. It's from English common law. And it just says local governments don't have sovereignty. They have to depend upon the state. So basically the state legislature gets to determine what a city or county or special district can or cannot do. So big picture. Central federal government is supreme, but has a limited number of things it can do. It can only do the things that's been said it can do in the Constitution. State governments can do almost anything, but if they run afoul of the central government, then the central government can overrule them and say, no, you can't do that. So, state governments, so are they sovereign? Yes, they're both technically sovereign. The central federal government is sovereign because when it can act, it has absolute, unquestioned authority to do what the Constitution says it can do. It is the final in charge person. However, in the massive number of areas where the federal government cannot act, state governments are supreme. They are sovereign. Why? Because they get to make the final determination in all of those cases. Okay, that's lecture 1. We're going to go over to kind of a historical overview next. Thank you.